Good day, and welcome to the International Cable Protection Committee's webinar, Cables and the Marine Environment, From Ocean to Cloud. The audio for this conference is streamed through your computer speakers, and if you're having any difficulties, please let us know through the Q&A window. We invite you to submit questions throughout the presentation by typing them in the Q&A window and hitting submit. All questions are private, and only our panel will see the questions. And any questions we don't get to during the webinar will be addressed offline following the event. And also, please take advantage of the resources at the bottom of the console screen where we've posted some useful documents and information for your reference. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our speaker for today, Professor Lionel Carter. Lionel is an Icpc environmental advisor and a professor at Victoria University in New Zealand. And now, without further delay, I'll turn the event over to you, Lionel.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is the inaugural Icpc webinar. My name's Lionel Carter, and today we're going to have a discussion centering on how submarine cables interact with the marine environment. But before starting, I would just like to thank the people who've made this webinar possible, and in particular Brian Lavallée and Joanna Harrington from Siena, and of course friends and colleagues at the Icpc Media Group. Also, having heard today's news about what's going on in the Ukraine, I can assure you this talk is the real deal. Okay. The recent wedding in the UK reminded me, I'm beginning to sound like a vicar at a Sunday ministry now, of Queen Elizabeth's coronation, which was is enshrined in New Zealand history because not only were we a member, or are a member, of the Commonwealth, but because on the eve of the coronation, she received news that Edmund Hillary of New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay of Nepal had climbed Mount Everest. Boy, that's a media windfall. News from those two events went around the world by subsea, telephonic cable, but nothing visual. That we didn't have the technology to do that. But the Brits were not deterred, and the coronation film was distributed around the planet by the Royal Air Force driving old Canberra jet bombers, dropping the film off that was later played at the local theatres. Boy, that's really changed. And the films and video and other media, we can just move them around the planet at will, and we have instantaneous access. It's understating that undersea cables are critical infrastructure which basically underpin much of our lives. But the significance of cables was realised as soon as the first cable was laid in 1858. The painter Constantino Brimoli adorned the dome of the US Capitol, obviously from the inside, with a fresco which is rather remarkable, and it was called the Apotheosis of George Washington. I didn't know what apotheosis meant, so I had to look it up on the dictionary, but it's basically raising George Washington to the status of a god. Now, in that, on the image, you can't see George Washington, but you can see in the top 1/3 a group of angels running around the dome, and above them would be George Washington. The bit that interests me is the tableau below, and there you can see various episodes from US history, which are basically major achievements since the time of George Washington. And the achievement that you could obviously see is Neptune, and there is Venus laying out the first transatlantic cable. It was regarded as one of the major events in US history. And just in coincidence, to the right, that studious group is basically representing science advances in the US, and it's coincidence, I think it is coincidence, that the two are juxtaposed, because as we go through this presentation, it will become quite clear that the cable industry and the science community have and continue to have quite strong ties. So this is the system which many of you will be familiar with. We're looking at something like 1.2 to 1.3 million kilometers of cable, roughly 440 to 450 systems, and I'm going to use a loose term here and simply call it the global network. In reality, it's not one entity, but a series of cable owners and operators, quite independent, and much like airlines, we could have a map of airlines over there, but we really know each one of those airlines is operated by an independent group. The role of modern cables, if you talk to people, and it's almost becoming a cliche, they think, well, when I press my send button on my mobile phone, the message goes by satellite. And most people are really quite staggered to learn that really they are going by subsea fibre optic cable. And the figures vary very slightly, but we're looking at something like over 95, perhaps 98% of transoceanic voice and data traffic, including the internet, is by a cable. Satellites, don't get me wrong, do have a major role to play with things like global television, providing connectivity in areas where there is no cable or where an area is badly affected by a disaster. But otherwise, communications by satellite is generally slower, certainly more expensive, and limited by volume. And a throwaway comment would be that if you put all the commercial communication satellites together, really they could only accommodate something like 7% of the US traffic. So they are very much volume limited. This is what we're dealing with. They're small. They have a small physical footprint, something like the size of a garden hose, but sometimes for protection they're armoured, and this could string out the diameter to something like 50 millimeters. They're made of non-toxic material. And if we look at the image and the cable working from the outside in, we see a sort of lightish pinkish color. That is, the pink is an artifact. But the material is marine grade polyethylene. You can probably just make out a slight reddening, which is as we go inwards, which is the conductor, electrical conductor. The silver zone is basically bunched steel wire, which gives the unit strength, and of course the fibers are very obvious to see. Basically, these are non-toxic materials in the marine environment. Most cables, over 80%, are laid on the seabed, whereas the remainder tend to be buried beneath the seabed for extra protection. And these are generally one-off events, except when there's repairs needed. And so we do get disturbance of the seabed on the continental shelf and on the upper continental slope down to water depths of about 1,500 meters, but that disturbance is temporary. If one is in the nearshore zone, say out to 30 meters water depth, any disturbance from cable burial is removed rather quickly. I'm talking about the next reasonable storm will come along and smooth that disturbance out. Several companies now recover cables. I was surprised at this, but they recover them primarily for the plastic. The plastic is such of high grade that it's fetching as prices as much as copper or any other recyclable material. The science we've looked at for cables, both within the Icpc, but more importantly, or just as importantly, with outside agencies with no links to cables, is showing that fibre optic cables have a low impact to neutral effect on the marine environment. With regards to marine life, there's really the studies that have been carried out, and some exhaustive studies have are now available, the results from those sort of work, particularly for the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Group in Monterey Bay, of course, and the time series they've done over, probably over a decade. It shows when you sample close to the cable, and we're talking about, say, within a metre of the cable, and look at samples far away, over 100 metres from the cable, there's really no statistical difference in abundance and the diversity of biota. Stuff near the cable is much the same as organisms away from the cable. Back in the Victorian times, there was a bout of whale entanglements. In particular, sperm whales were found entangled in sperm whales were entangled with cables, and that became rather obvious when the cables were brought up to the ship to be repaired. There will be remains of sperm whales. That ceased very much later on, and so when we changed from telegraphic cables, these were the culprits with the ensnarements, to coaxial cables and certainly to fibre-optic cables, entanglements basically ceased. And the reason for this was marked changes in cable design. In particular, well, a good way to explain it is when you get a domestic garden hose, you will notice there's fibre-optic reinforcing going one way and fiberglass reinforcing going the other way. And it counters any torsional effect. So when you put that hose on the ground, it doesn't coil up on itself. And the old telegraphic cables had this tendency, and so they formed a bird's nest on the seabed, which unfortunately acted for a trap. But improved cable design and certainly improved techniques in laying have prevented any entanglements with transoceanic cables. That last bullet sort of is a response to a media furore in 2014. It was in Shark Week, which I think is next month. But somebody found a video YouTube of a shark biting a cable. And this sent people into a frenzy. You know, the headlines were, "Jaws will take out the internet," that sort of thing. It ran riot. And when one looks at the data, and this is important for what I'm going to come to a bit later on regarding the Icpc, when you look at the data, say from 1959 to 2006, fish biting cables, I'm talking primarily about sharks and barracuda, those fish biting cables accounted for less than 0.5% of all cable faults. From 2006 to the present day, we've had no failures of cables resulting from fish bite. So, yep, it made great reading. Jaws drags down the internet, but the reality is quite differently. And it's important, I think, to get the facts in the public arena so we can sort of, hopefully, counter some of the more speculative things about cables. However, faults are a fact of life. I'm going to say there's a lot of cables on the seabed, that 1.2 to 1.3 million kilometres, and they go in a variety of environments. But this image here just simply shows where most faults are found. It covers roughly about 40% of all cable faults for that period, 1959 to 2006. But what you can see is that each of those red blobs is a cable fault, that the main areas of faulting occur, for example, off Japan, right down to Southeast Asia, in the shallow peripheral seas, certainly in the Mediterranean, certainly in the North Sea, and areas marginal to the US. There are some faults in the deep sea, but in general, the deep sea has a low number of faults. Off the top of the head, these amount to something like 4% of all cable faults worldwide. So what causes the faults? Well, I'm afraid it's us. The largest number of faults are associated with bottom trawl fishing, and in that inset you can see with the arrow, you can see two black lines coming up to the trawl, which is basically a cable operator's nightmare, and shipping. So the blue covers that attributed to fishing, and the red accounts for faults related to ships' anchors. And you can sort of see a bit of it's a very real change starting at about 1970, when the number of cable faults related to shipping anchors increased. Just looking through shipping records the other day, that can be attributed to a marked change in the nature of shipping. We're getting large bulk carriers coming on stream, so they're bigger, they're faster, and they're more numerous. And so with a large ship accidentally dragging its anchor is a formidable threat to a cable. And so in round figures, we could sort of say 70 to 80% of cable faults are affected by human activities. When we look at the green and the orange, they're basically faults relating to natural hazards. In this case, a mix of wave and current action, and what we call geological faults, which are basically the submarine landslides and turbidity currents formed under earthquakes. And they make up a modest amount, in round figures, generally about 12% or less. The point with natural hazards is when they occur big time. This is one of my favorite slides. It's so easy to, it's such a simple slide, but it shows so much. The red dots are basically earthquakes magnitude greater than 5. And the yellow dots are basically cities with populations exceeding 1 million. That's all it is. But it's quite a powerful slide, and it's showing that there are a lot of cities in earthquake-prone areas, particularly around the Circum-Pacific Rim, where you see cities like Los Angeles, Tokyo. When we get down to Indonesia, Jakarta, it looks like it's totally covered by earthquakes. And I've just noticed that New Zealand has been officially removed, mainly by earthquakes. But those zones with the high activity of earthquakes also have large cities. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted for the West Coasters of the US. What that means is the cities still need cables, and so it's inevitable that cables must cross zones which are prone to large natural hazards. So in the case of the Pacific Rim, the Pacific Ring of Fire, if you like, the big cities around there, to reach those cities, cables have to cross rather hazardous zones. Just a case study here, and if we just focus on those 3 small pictures on the right-hand side, this is work which has been undertaken by Icpc in collaboration with the National Oceanographic Centre in the UK and the Sun Yat-sen University in Taiwan. And the upper image shows a mass of dots, and I think it's 15 years of earthquake records. Each one of those dots is an earthquake epicenter. The important ones are the ones which are large, and the red ones which are shallow. So a large, shallow earthquake creates a lot of problems. And so Taiwan, we get frequent earthquakes. It's one of the most seismic areas on the planet. And what those earthquakes do is 2 things. It disturbs the landscape, and so we get a lot of landslides. And once you've created landslides, that material is really exposed to erosion. And so when we go down to the next panel, we see that Taiwan is subject to at least 3 to 4 typhoons per annum, and there's good evidence to show that these typhoons are becoming more intense. And the typhoons attacking those landslides created by the earthquakes simply means it delivers a lot of sediment to the world ocean. And so we go down to the third of the trio. We see a picture taken of the Gaoping. This is in southern Taiwan, and that muddy plume is associated with Typhoon Morakot, when 3 meters of rain fell in 3 days, 1 meter per day, and a huge amount of sediment was introduced to the marine environment. the sediment going in can do one of two things. It could just sit on the continental shelf, the shallow waters surrounding Taiwan, where it's basically a gun that has been loaded and ready to be triggered, generally by an earthquake or by storms. Alternatively, if there's so much water going in this case the Gaoping River, that water is so charged with sediment, there's so much sediment in those floodwaters, it sinks and takes off downslope. And we'll just run this little animation, and you can sort of see the Gaoping River, the river that's shown in the third down little inset, the water going into a submarine canyon and running down for about 400 kilometers. The black lines you see are submarine cables, a rather expensive tracer for tracking these things, but as this current flows down, and it's flowing up to 40 kilometers per hour, it breaks cables. And so in this context, in the case of Typhoon Morakot, 10 cables were broken simply by the floodwaters sinking. When we have an earthquake, as we did in 2006, the seabed is shaken, there's all that mud sitting on the top, that is also destabilized, it forms landslides, as happened here, and that landslide transforms into a turbidity current, one of these rapid moving sediment charge flows, and moves downslope to break cables. The effect of that is quite dramatic. Now this is, and I'm very careful here, this is a measure of traffic. Prior to the earthquake, it's only for 7 cables. And there's 10 more cable systems that pass through the Strait of Luzon. And several of those remained intact. But during the great earthquake, magnitude 7 in 2006, what happened was we had an abrupt change in traffic, an abrupt reduction. Importantly, the light blue cable, for example, temporarily went out, was brought back on track very quickly. Similarly with the olive and the green traffic indicators, and those cables tended to come back online rather quickly. Other cables were badly damaged and had to wait to be repaired. But the cables that were intact took up the traffic and also hopefully accommodated traffic from cables that had been damaged. And so the internet continued, albeit at a very slow pace. And repairs took about 7 weeks, but in that time, connectivity remained. You could still email, but if you're looking at YouTube, it's going to be slow. But the important thing is that connectivity remained. When we, just getting my thoughts here, when we sort of investigate natural hazards, some of the most important data that you can have in an assessment are good observations. Now, in any industry, I'm not talking about just the cabling, but in any industry, there generally is a lot of knowledge and a lot of observations about cables. And in the Icpc, we've taken the stance that we'd rather have an evidence-based approach to assessing natural hazards rather than expert opinion. And this seems to be a trend around the world, that people are now asking for evidence-based knowledge about some particular aspect rather than just relying on the opinions of experts. So in that context, Icpc, with its scientific partners, have gone about their way of getting the data from various members, putting that data together, looking at hazards, quantifying hazards, putting that data together for informed people, so that there is an evidence-based knowledge system that the Icpc can put forward. I'm the first to admit any science paper or any technical paper is dry reading, and generally people who are non-experts just look at it aghast. So an important aspect is to get that science in the public arena, and we've done that with a couple of publications. The one in the lower left-hand corner with a pale blue cover, that was a project we undertook with the United Nations Environmental Programme. And it's a simple set of observations, what cables are, what they're made of, how they're laid, what hazards they face, but it's based on the technical reports and the technical scientific papers, the peer-reviewed papers. So it's well-founded in fact, but it's written in a way which is readily understandable. Can we prove that? Well, we just look at the numbers. The PDF of this booklet has been downloaded. Generally, it's been hitting about 7,000 to 8,000 downloads a year, and up to now we've been looking at about 100,000 downloads. What that's saying is people want to know about cables, but it has to be in a digestible form. So we go through this sort of tiered process. Yep, we got observations. Can we use the observations? Yes. We use those for technical reports to determine, for example, hazard risks. We take those technical reports, convert them to ready-to-read booklets, which then passes that information on to policymakers or the general public who may not be technically aware of submarine cables. The fact that we sort of live in the ocean means that we have to collaborate with other users, and that began from the word go. This stuff fascinates me because the HMS Challenger was a rather remarkable expedition, which was basically, it was the first oceanographic expedition on the planet, and it basically started in Victorian times, laying of the first cables, 1858 and 1866. There was a debate. There was a school of thought which said that life can't exist below 500 fathoms. That's about 910 meters. And the reason for that, pretty subjective, was that it was too cold, too deep. In other words, there was too much pressure, and there was no light. And so it was basically too hostile. But when they brought up cables, as they did, certainly in spades during 1858, some of those cables had living organisms, even though they were at abyssal depths of the ocean in 2,000 to 3,000 meters of water. So to settle the debate, the Royal Society in the UK, amongst others, undertook what was the first, as I mentioned before, the first global ocean survey. And one of the major findings, of course, was they found life at all depths. But you can sort of see cables played this pivotal role in getting this major survey underway. And another example, back in 1929, we had the Grand Banks earthquake. And at the top of the head, 22 cables were broken. Now, the work was studied in detail in 1952 by the Lamont Geological Observatory, as it was known then. And they picked up that the cables broke sequentially. So one broke at 3 o'clock, one broke at 3:10, one broke at 3:30. And what they were looking at was the turbidity current, moving down the slope, moving into water 5,300 meters deep, and reaching speeds of up to about 68 kilometers per hour. And so what they were showing was that the deep ocean is not a quiet abyss. It is quite dynamic. And that work is continuing today. We're having large parts of the world subject to these turbidity currents. They may be set off by earthquakes, they may be set off by storms, but these guys are delivering material from the shallows, say there's 200 meters water depth, that sort of depth, and delivering it, well, to how deep the ocean is. What is happening now is we're starting to have a new insight into how the ocean ticks. Remember, the ocean is 71% of the planet, and we've always wondered, how do those how do the organisms function in the deep ocean? And there's now one school of thought saying, well, it's these turbidity currents and landslides that remobilizing the nutrient-rich sediments and deposits on the continental shelf and the upper continental slope, and the turbidity currents are transferring that material to depth, where these guys get a real burst of nutrients, they get a burst of temperature to help, and they get a burst of carbon. So there's now a school of thought, you know, certainly helped by the data that's come out from the submarine cables, which is saying we're getting this transfer of nutrients and energy to help to contribute feeding deep sea ecosystems. We're certainly involved with other organisations sharing the seabed, and in this case this is the International Seabed Authority. We're looking at a section of exploration permits. The areas marked APAI are areas areas of particular environmental interest. The point being, here we have another seabed user, and we have cables going in through part of that zone, which is being set aside for mining, in this case of the polymetallic nodules, which are sort of prized for their copper, cobalt, zinc, as well as manganese, and some of them potentially have rare earth elements. So mining will go ahead, but we have to ensure the integrity or the protection of the cables. And so negotiations are underway, and of course this is quite often starts as an exchange of information. And it's the same old story as I was mentioning before. Once people realize that it's not just a cable, but the globe's nervous system, it's the backbone of the internet, if you like, they take a new look at what they're dealing with. So by exchanging information, I mean, so the cable industry is learning too about how mining takes place, the potential impacts on cables. We are learning through exchange of information, and hopefully this is going to lead into sort of measures that will protect cables against, for example, in this case, seabed mining. We also work with environmental organisations, and this is a case study here with the Sargasso Sea Alliance. They've looked at setting aside a large chunk of the Sargasso Sea, I think it's about 4 million square kilometres, outside exclusive economic zones, because of the ecological importance of the sargassum weed. The sargassum weed acts as a sort of a important environment for a lot of transient species, for turtles, for eels, and they were interested in what the potential threat from laying cables. And when you look at the inset, there's a few cables that go through. The circle is the exclusive economic zone around Bermuda, and there are a few cables going through. So we had a one-day conference, and again it was the exchange of information. And in general, people just don't have that knowledge about cables. So what did they learn? Well, the size of the cable is basically non-intrusive in a sense. This is all deep water, and a 17 to 22 millimeter diameter cable would be laid on the seabed without disturbing, without the need for burial. They learned that the historical record for cable faults is one every 6 years, and so just the physical impact of putting cables in seemed to be quite minimal. There will be one ship's track to lay the cable, and it will be laid on the seabed, and it's a very small physical object. So again, once they see this data, and once they realise the importance of submarine cables, the attitude towards putting cables on the seabed does change. Well, that's about the summation, and I'll just go through these. If you want to take 4 points away, it should be these. I think the first one is self-evident. for people in the cable industry, this is what we deal with. Cables are basically the backbone of the internet. Over 98% of our data transfer, certainly of our voice communications, and as I mentioned, the internet. In the case of New Zealand, all our banking, virtually all our banking is undertaken in Australia. So the Trans-Tasman cable link is basically our economic lifeline. The science is pretty conclusive in that cables are a low impact use of the ocean, low impact to neutral use, and that's basically how the sciences function, and it shows the importance of doing that science, making sure it's independently reviewed, putting it out in quality science magazines just to support that contention. We live at a time of marked change in the ocean, both from an environmental point of view and both from a political point of view, a legislative point of view. Despite that, the global network is quite resilient. It's tested periodically with major earthquakes. The 2003 Algerian earthquake caused 35 cable faults, but connectivity was back within less than 72 hours. The 2006 event in Taiwan, there was 22 faults in 14 cables. There was a very brief loss of connectivity, but cables came online as traffic was rerouted through intact systems. And that was well shown in 2011 during the magnitude 9.2 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, that you barely knew that 14 cables had been taken out. For the simple reason there were so many intact cables left which took up the slack. So the argument here is that the global network is resilient despite major, which can be regarded as major disruptions, despite the increasing human activities offshore. And this is probably the one that is also self-evident but rarely practiced, is we have to keep on conversing with other seabed users to make sure they understand what the cable industry is about, and of course vice versa, we have to understand what the other seabed user is about. We take some pride in saying the material that the information that we put forward is well established in fact, and that's one of the reasons why we take a reasonable amount of effort in producing peer-reviewed papers. And on that note, I thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lionel. And I think we have some time to dive into some questions. And just as a reminder to everybody, you can type your question in the Q&A window and hit submit. All questions are private, and only we on the back end here will see your questions. And if we don't get to your questions now, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the event. I see that we've already received several in there, so we can probably jump in, Lionel, if you'd like to get started.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. The first question really goes for the jugular. How would you address a hypothetical comment that your research could favour the industry, given your position as the IPC's Marine Environmental Advisor? Well, I'm not working for the tobacco industry, but I often think about this personally, and it's sort of, there are a number of safeguards against being a mouthpiece for cables in the marine environment. First of all, and I've probably said it over and over again in this presentation, we put the material in established, peer-reviewed science papers. So we write the science up, we submit it, and it goes to independent reviewers. the booklet we produced with the UNEP, it went actually to 14 reviewers. And a paper we've just published recently on seabed recovery went to 4 independent reviewers. These are picked out by the journal, and 2 of them were biologists and 2 of them were physicists, so we covered a range of disciplines. So putting it out in referee journals is one safeguard. You can tell by the authorships of these papers that we run, and in some instances with world-class scientists from the National Oceanographic Centre in the UK, from Taiwan, and from the University of Durham. For me personally, the society of which I'm a fellow has very strict guidelines on behaviour and scientific behaviour of scientists, and in that context, and again with similar rules for the university, one has to be quite dispassionate about the research one does. So with the publications, with the working with other universities, with the rules and regulations that govern me professionally, I'm sort of quite relaxed in working and providing material for the cable industry. Here's one, very topical. Is climate change affecting the hazard risk for submarine cables? In dealing with risk, I've always been taken by major insurance companies. You'd think they'd be the most conservative groups out, and indeed they are, but groups like Munich RE stands for reinsurance, keep remarkable records of disasters affecting, obviously, their business, but affecting people worldwide. In other words, they also look at disasters where people are uninsured. And they have certainly shown major changes in disasters related to climate, when I mean climate, I mean long-term changes in the weather. And the classic example of that was the recent fires caused by long-term droughts in California. They look at disasters caused by severe weather events. And again, we just had to look at what happened during the hurricane season in the Gulf of Mexico last year. They also cover geological hazards. But what they're seeing is that there's a continually steep rise in disasters related to weather and climate. In the case of cables, there would be an expectation if cables are being damaged by weather events, then that damage may translate into, for example, more frequent flood damage, or more frequent flood-related events. And what we're seeing off Taiwan, of southern Taiwan, is that there has been an increase in the number of cables damaged by floods and storms. In other words, like I was looking for Typhoon Morakot, the rivers become so choked with mud that when they discharge their floodwaters, that material, that dense material, takes off as cable damaging turbidity currents. There is some argument that that has increased, but the numbers, there's not many numbers there to conclusively say that that's a distinct trend. But what we're seeing is consistent with what the meteorologists are saying, that storms are becoming more intense. So that's one aspect. When we come ashore, which is outside my realm, but we saw major weather-related events. Hurricane Sandy was a classic, where we have a major storm which generated a 4-metre high storm surge, which inundated southern Manhattan, which in turn flooded some of the major computer centres there. But that's not the submarine cable industry. Sea level rise, which is ongoing and increasing, particularly off the eastern US, where you have a double hit of the sea levels rising and the land is going down to groundwater extraction. We will see sea level rise effects presumably there, but again, that is outside the Icpc work, except to say that sea level will rise, storm surges will go on shore, as we've seen previously, and there is potential damage to, for example, land-based stations. Although, having said that, I fully appreciate that some companies now are, for want of a better term, building larger stations further away from the coast, perhaps higher off the coast, certainly reinforced to withstand sort of any surge attack. So on the safe side, the industry is responding. The jury's out whether we see distinct trends, but certainly the short-term trends we see, for example, off Taiwan's consistent with what we know about increasing, excuse me, increasing effects of the weather. Wow, sorry, the pause is I'm still taken back by this question. And the question is, what is your view on the recent media stories regarding cable security? I'm a scientist and I like to see the data. And unfortunately, the news releases, for example, submarines potentially having a potential to cut out cables and bring down the internet. In my opinion, and I'm sort of separating myself from the Icpc on this, is a personal opinion, they're long on speculation and very short on fact. And quite honestly, I'm having trouble differentiating fact from fiction. It makes great reading, but the factual material is lacking a bit. I guess one of the things we can take some assurance from is that basically since the post-Korean conflict, in the period we've had where we've had relatively peaceful times, the Icpc, which came into effect in 1958, has provided security for basically what it is, we call it the civil global network. In other words, the cables run by private companies. And I'd like to think that the ICP provides the forum, and I witness this personally, and it's technical and scientific advice and data, which I can put my hand on my heart, has improved cable protection. A couple of examples, when we look at records of cable faults and normalize them to cable faults per 1,000 kilometers of cable, we actually see a decrease in the number of faults. In the case of Taiwan, we're now seeing cable owners and operators shifting their cables away, in the case of Australia Luzon, to areas of the submarine canyon where all those turbidity currents go down, taking their cables to distant parts of the canyon where the turbidity currents are known to slow right down and hence pose less of an impact on cable systems. So those things are taking place, and the other final off the top of the head comment is that when we've had major breaks in cables, not just a submarine cutting 1 or 5, when we've had major breaks, Algeria 35 breaks, Taiwan 22 breaks, Newfoundland 29 breaks, when we've had, 23 breaks in Newfoundland, when we see that and that the system recovers generally quite quickly, then we can be assured that the cable system has some resilience. These natural hazards, they're big reductions, they're big disruptions, and lessons from those has shown us that A, connectivity survives, albeit at a bit slower, and B, recovery can be quite rapid, full recovery can be quite rapid. So one should take heart that the technological advances made by the cable companies in rerouting material, building in safer places, has an important role to play when we think about terrorist attacks on cables. The data shows that the system is indeed resilient. Okay, we have a question here. Does the IPC share area region specific big data analysis to help operators mitigate against effects of weather climate? For example, mapping of turbidity movements. The research component, we haven't gone into the big data analysis as yet, but we have done a fair amount of science on turbidity currents, and there's several science papers available. For example, looking at a global picture of cyclone damage. For example, looking at a picture of earthquake damage to cables. So the work we've done collaboratively with the UK, we do have papers like that, and if the questioner would like to email me, I'm very happy to provide copies of those with him. So in answer, we do some of that data analysis, but basically we rely on the interaction with one at the moment. So the Icpc is a modest size organisation, and the Marine Environmental Advisor is it. But through our collaborations, we have done global summaries of cables and hazards. And as I say, if the questioner sends me an email, I can send that material to him. The next question is, do you think cable recovery for out-of-service cables will be mandatory in coming years? Frankly, I don't know. What I do know is that there are now 3 organisations which are recovering and recycling cables, and that activity is increasing. It's non-mandatory and it is increasing. So there is some forward motion there. There's always a possibility that a nation will do that, but it should be, if they want it to become mandatory, they really have, the homework really has to be done. For example, okay, it may be okay to pull a cable out from the deep ocean, and generally that's where most cables come from. But when we come inshore, if, for example, a cable has become heavily encrusted with marine organisms, is it better to leave the cable there, or would it be more disruptive to the environment to pull it out? That work needs to be done, and I would like to think that if any policy analyst looks at that, they should have the full picture. Is it better to leave the cable there? I mean, say some areas off Maryland and that part of the US continental shelf, they've actually used cables not pulled out for recycling, but redistributed to form artificial reefs. So the picture is not clear-cut. But as I say, the important thing, do the science, do some areas, and there have been studies made by a group called the EMU group, who looked at the sort of like a cost-benefit analysis of taking cables. The analysis relates to environmental harm. And again, if the person who sent in the question emails me, I'm very happy to send that open file report to him. Here's a sorry for the delay. This was a long question just to read. And it goes, you mentioned that deep sea mining is a potential threat going forward, and that the Icpc has been engaging with the ISA. However, the most recent draft of the ISA exploitation regulations still does not offer adequate protection measures. How do you think the submarine cable community can best address what are politically, fiscally driven policies? Asking a scientist that, what is fiscally and politically driven policies, that's a tricky one. But I would like to think that an observational or scientific approach or scientific reinforcement of the arguments would hopefully win the day. I fully appreciate the sentiment behind this. One could say, well, there are certain, how shall I put it? There's certainly political risk involved for people who are looking to run these policies. For example, if a cable is broken and yet the observations are showing that this was always on the cards, where does that leave the cable industry? Yes, it leaves it with a broken cable, but is there any recourse for the mining against, say, for example, a mining company when they were perfectly aware of the potential hazards? And I guess this is what the ISA are doing, is they sort of hopefully are coming around to thinking what the potential hazards are, and it would be up to Icpc to articulate those back to the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, and to note what the potential outcome would be if that hazard was realised and the cable was damaged. Not only the cost of repairs, but there's also, for example, a very strong social, economic cost for when a cable goes out, particularly if the cable is coming from small island nations where they only have one direct link. So I would certainly, at present, it's not an ideal situation, and I think we should sort of look at getting some information together to put a case forward that if this goes ahead, these are the potential risks, these are the potential costs. The next question is a very topical one. What are the potential impacts on and danger to marine environment by laying submarine cables in the Arctic? The Arctic is, as the questioner must realise, is a real hotspot for activity. And the key problems that I can see is that with the loss of ice, that first of all we are changing landing sites. The landing sites have suddenly become dynamic. The ice is gone. What was previously frozen sediment is now soft sediment. That's exposed to wave activity. that's going to erode, and the change at the coast is going to be quite dramatic. The sediment has to go somewhere, and so if there are submarine canyons nearby, there is the potential to set off these landslides and turbidity currents. Those impacts will be better refined once we have a decent seabed map of the Arctic. The US, Canada, Russia, and other nations are mapping that margin. And once we get that, we'll know, are there submarine canyons there? Are those submarine canyons active? And if the case, how will we lay a cable across that potential hazard? So there are dangers, without doubt, to the environment. The environment is going to be dynamic. It is changing as we speak. I mean to say, we're seeing large disruptions of the ice there by storms, simply because we're changing the albedo of the Arctic Ocean. We're getting large expanses of dark ocean, which are soaking up the heat. Once we do that, it releases the heat. We get storms. 2 years ago, we had a storm which affected the entire Arctic Ocean. The impact of that was to break up the ice, making it more amenable to melting. So there's a lot of unknowns, but I would probably go back to basics, map the system. From that, you'll get a rough idea of what the potential hazardous zones are. With the mapping, you'd see, for example, areas of landsliding or potential landsliding. We'll see submarine canyons. We'll see areas which look stable and which may be preferential sites for cables. But certainly it's inevitable cables are going to go across the Arctic, and basically where those cables will be laid will rely on the quality of the seabed. Well, there's one more. I think that there's one more question, and this one is. Let's have a look. Yeah, I like this one. What's the importance of all this science to the Icpc and the cable industry? Well, hopefully I gave inklings of that, my reflection on that. Basically, the industry has a lot of information, and I've been rather fortunate to have access to some of that information. And once we have that, we have good hard data to basically say things which are backed up by science. If we're talking to UNET, for example, we can put our hands on the hearts and saying, we know areas of the world which are subject to turbidity currents or subject to cyclone damage. It's basically, once you've got the science, it's formalized those observations. You send those observations in a paper, you set those observations in interpretation in a paper, you send that to the journal referees it. Is it good quality? No. Or is it bad quality? Good quality, it goes through. It stood a test of scrutiny, and so one can use that information without fear or favour to back up your arguments. So if we go back to the ISA, hopefully we'll have information which will say potential damage from mining activities is such and such. This is what the data shows, and I have to be upfront here that the database on that is pretty sparse. But we can use peer-reviewed science to sort of back our arguments up with some sort of rigour. And quite often, people who challenge those things don't have the rigorous background to sort of at least force an informed argument. So on that note, I think we've just about gone through the major questions. Over to you, Joanna.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Lionel. A lot of great questions coming in. And obviously, if there's a couple questions, if we didn't get to yours, by all means, we'll be following up. And if anything else comes to you, feel free to reach out. There's a post-event survey that we'd love for you to take a moment to complete once the event has ended, because your feedback really is important to us to ensure that we deliver the most informative webinars that we can. So officially, this now concludes our Icpc webinar, Cables in the Marine Environment from Ocean to Cloud. Thank you so much, Lionel, and thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. Thank you so much, and have a great day.